and welcome back to another session on methodology of literature. This is the 7th class. Now, the 7th video, that is, on methodology of literature. So, last class we discussed Renaissance, and we also discussed various changes that Renaissance brought in the whole of Europe and also in England. Now let's take a quick look into how Renaissance shaped the British Islands, or Renaissance shaped England and its literature. So before we move on to literature of the Elizabethan literature or the Elizabethan period, let's have an understanding of the Tudor dynasty. As I told you, why we are going in detail is when you study something, you have to study it properly. And English literature and its history go hand in hand. Unless you understand or know the background, the historical background of England, you will not be able to appreciate the literature of the country. So let's have an understanding of the Tudor dynasty. Now, in the last few classes, when we stopped with the Battle of Bosworth Field, which brought an end to the Norman conquest, or which brought an end to the French Norman reign, and it saw the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Henry Richmond, who is now crowned as Henry VII, was the only son of Margaret Beaufort, who belonged to the House of Lancaster. Now, you do remember Henry Richmond, don't you? Henry Richmond is the one who defeated Richard III and brought an end to the reign of France, or reign of the French reign in England. Now, he is also the one who joined both the houses, that is the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Now, what is the reason behind his role in joining these two houses? See, basically, Henry Richmond belonged to, from his mother's side, from maternal side, he belonged to the House of Lancaster. But his father, who was a Tudor, he did not belong to any of the houses, but he secretly sided the House of York. So Henry Richmond is from the House of Lancaster. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, is from the House of Lancaster. His father, Edmund Tudor belonged, or he was from the Tudor family, which is an aristocratic family, not a royal family. It's just an aristocratic family, and they secretly supported the House of York. All right. Now, Henry's father, who was Edmund Tudor, he was the first Earl of Richmond, who was actually the half brother to Henry VI. You do remember Henry VI, don't you? After I did speak about Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. Henry V is Prince Hall, remember? And then he has a son, Henry VI, who is actually infirm. He was a very infirm and weak ruler. Do you remember? Yeah. So Henry VI has a half-brother, like they're step-brothers, half-brother, and that is Edmund Tudor. And Edmund Tudor, though he is partly from the royal side. You can only say that he's partly from the royal side. You can call him or state that he's an aristocrat. He cannot be completely from, or he does not have any lineage to the throne. He not lineage. He does not have any direct position or direct power to the throne of England. He is just a half brother of Richard VI. So anyway, Edmund Tudor marries Margaret Beaufort. Now, Margaret Beaufort was already married. When she was just 13 years old, she got married, and unfortunately, that marriage did not do well. It was annulled, and later she gets married to Edmund Tudor and has a son, Henry Tudor. So the story goes like this, that Edmund Tudor helped the House of York, that is Richard of York, and Richard of York was the grandson of Edward III. Okay, Edward III's great grandson was Richard York, and he was from the House of York. Okay, so Edmund Tudor, who is actually the half brother of Henry VI and the father of Henry Richmond, married Margaret Beaufort from the House of Lancaster. Edmund Tudor is from the Tudor family, and he secretly supported or sided the great grandson of Edward III, that is Richard of York. Alright, now we also discussed the wars between the two families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Edmund, since he sided the York, they had a war, and House of Lancaster won and House of York, they lost the war, and all those people who sided the House of York was imprisoned, and therefore Edmund Tudor was also captured and he was imprisoned. Edmund and later Edmund, he dies of plague. So Henry's now if you are to look at who this Tudor family is, Henry's paternal father, Edmund Tudor's father was Owen Tudor, and he was from Wales. So he was from a small province or a village in Wales, northern part of Wales, and they were not exactly from the royal side. Owen Tudor was the son of a rebel, and he was a courtier who secretly married Catherine, the widowed queen of Lancastrian King Henry V, that is Prince Hall. Okay, so that's how the story goes. It's a long story, which contains adulterous affairs as well. So why I'm saying all this is because when you look at Henry Richmond, there are certain things that you may want to question, like his royal blood, since he is from an aristocratic family but not completely from the royal side. His grandfather had an adulterous affair, secretly married Catherine, the widowed wife of Henry V, and then they have children, and that is Edmund Tudor and his brother. So Edmund Tudor was the eldest son. Now, who's this Edmund Tudor? I hope you haven't got disconnected. Edmund Tudor is Henry Richmond's father, and Henry Richmond is none other than Henry VII, who defeated whom? Who defeated Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Field, which marked an end to the French rule in England and marks the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Edmund Tudor is the father of Henry VII. So Henry is not exactly from the royal side. That's what I want you to bear in mind. His mother is from the Lancaster, or his mother is from the royal side, half royal, half aristocrat. So Henry was born with the slightest claim to the throne, and his claim was interestingly very complicated. There is no chance, in fact, of Henry being the King of England. Now, how does then he become the king? Let's see. He had, as a child, he had seen the nightmarish politics of the War of Roses. Again, I did tell you about this War of Roses. War of Roses was an internal fight, an internal war that took place between two families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, each claiming to each fighting to have a claim to the throne. Now, Henry was an abused child, or rather to say, Henry had lived in a very hostile environment. He was forcibly taken from Margaret when he was just 5 years old, when he was just a small boy. Because, see, this was Henry is the son of Margaret and Edmund Tudor, and it is Margaret's second marriage. Now, with Edmund Tudor's death, she was just or hardly 15 or so when Edmund Tudor died, and during those times, if you don't remarry, or if you, especially in the aristocratic families, if with the husband's death, if they do not take a husband, then there are chances that their parents or the relatives would force a person on the woman. And Margaret had lived a hellish life. Her first marriage was a terrible affair, and so was the second marriage with Edmund Tudor. And now she decides to take a husband for herself, and she gets married. All right, and she chooses Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, to make herself secure. Now, this is her third marriage, and Henry, that is the son of her second husband, Edmund Tudor, was taken away from her by force and was given to William Lord Herbert to be taken care of. William Lord Herbert becomes the guardian of Henry VII. You must be thinking, why am I saying all these things? Just be patient and listen to the story. Just listen to it as a story, because you have to understand the attitude of, in order to understand why Henry became a powerful ruler, or how he was able to rule the country well. You have to understand Henry Richmond at close quarters. Now, young Henry, he grew up having never known a father, and now parted from his mother at a very early age. However, Lady Luck did shine bright on him, because the Herberts had perhaps treated him kindly and was given gentleman's education. The mad war between the two families and the execution of various noblemen were common during that period. Each one was fighting for the throne, and therefore Lord Herbert also was executed. Now Henry had to take refuge under Lady Herbert. Now, it is also told that there is a prophecy in England, or there was a prophecy made that one day Henry Richmond would become the King of England when he was a small child. Now, because of this prophecy, it is even said that many people, many rulers, even including Louis the 11th of France, tried to was desperate to take this boy into his clutches. So this was because they were all scared of this prophecy, and it made others, those who had their eye on the throne, and gave them an insecure feeling. Eventually, by the reign of Richard III, remember Richard III of Gloucester, he was in fact a very cunning man, and he imprisoned a lot of people from both these families. He executed many noblemen, and therefore what happened was he left there were very few claimants to the throne of England, because Richard III had almost executed all of them, and that left to Henry Richmond, who had now a fairly possible chance of getting to the throne, because Richard III had executed many claimants to the throne of England. It left Henry Richmond with fairly a claim to the throne of England. Henry, thinking about this possibility, was encouraged by his mother, Margaret. And Margaret, she was from Lancaster, remember, who was in fact plotting against Richard III also. Henry led an invasion from Brittany in 1485 and defeated Richmond at what we had already discussed, the Battle of Bosworth Field, and thus becomes the King of England. So, thus Henry becomes the King of England. Now that he has become the King of England, his mother, who's from the House of Lancaster, he decides to take a wife for himself, and he, in order to reunite both the families and put an end to this war between the two houses, he decides to marry a woman, a beautiful princess or a beautiful girl from, not princess, a beautiful girl from the House of York, and that was Elizabeth of York. Now, Elizabeth being from the royal blood, and he having a royal side from his mother's from the maternal side, made him very powerful. And thus he unites both the houses, and the War of Roses comes to an end. Henry, when he came to power, had to prove himself and assert his royalty or royal authority. Henry did everything to make him powerful and to make his rule secure. He used his power strongly, and his government, or he used his power and his rule to cleverly stop the members of the nobility from overthrowing him. He knew that the War of Roses itself was a struggle for power. They were fighting amongst each other trying to prove their claim to the throne. So he knew that he was in the middle or in midst of these strong, powerful, dangerous, noble men, and therefore, in order to make himself very strong, in order to make his rule more secure, he wields his power and authority in a very careful manner. He had their private armies. Now, these people, the nobles from both the houses, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and also various other noblemen, they all had private armies, like the security guards or the bodyguards that the present, the new nowadays, the new generation film stars or the celebrities would have. Just like that, they also had private armies, and they were all disbanded by Henry the Seventh, and he had his own bodyguard, the yeoman, the guard, to protect him. Henry believed in absolute power, and he felt that the king should rule as they saw fit without having to answer to the nobles, the church, or the parliament. That is, he believed in the absolute or the divine right of kings, or the absolute power. All right, he ran the court of Star Chamber, a court run by men who were loyal to the king. So he had a court called the Star Chamber, and this Star Chamber consisted of only those nobles or those men who were loyal to the king. He was also a responsible king, okay, and he was very careful with money, and it was in his power, or it was in his rule, that England became really powerful and wealthy, very prosperous as well. The treasury was full because he was a clever king, and he did not fight or go into wars unnecessarily. He avoided wars because he knew that it was futile and would only result in a wastage of money and men. So to develop better relations abroad and to avoid all these costly foreign wars, he was very very clever, and he arranged for his eldest son Arthur to marry the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine is going to be a very important figure in our literature, because soon this princess from Spain not only becomes the wife of Arthur, she becomes the wife of Arthur only for few months, because by that time Arthur dies, and he does not even get to become, he's actually the legitimate heir to the throne. He should be the next heir, or the next king after Henry the Seventh, but he dies at a very young age, leaving Catherine a widow. Now again, this marriage was specifically arranged to have it was a political marriage, because this was arranged to keep England safe from the attack of of Spain, and therefore when Arthur dies, to maintain that friendship between Spain and England, Henry decides to get his second son, that is, who would become the next king of England, King Henry the Eighth, to marry this princess, the princess from Spain, or the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Well, the marriage between Catherine of Aragon and Henry in the beginning was not a bad one, as a general thing that we have always heard that it was an unhappy, broken marriage. Yes, it was, but they lived happily for about 10-12 years, and it was only after that the trouble began, because Catherine couldn't give Henry an heir, something that he was looking for, and that was a child, an heir to the throne. Catherine had a lot of miscarriages, and the only surviving child was Queen Mary, or Queen Mary that we will have soon. ruling after the death of Henry. First comes Edward, and then comes a few queens who ruled only for say 9 days, and then comes Queen Mary, and after her death comes Queen Elizabeth. So before we move on to that, Henry's main agitation or his anger towards, or the result of this unhappy marriage, because Catherine was a very beautiful woman, and he was kind of okay in having his sister-in-law as his wife, because Catherine and Arthur lived together only for a few months, very few months. So their life initially was happy, but trouble in their marriage or marital discord started happening when Catherine failed to produce an heir to the throne, and also there was another reason as well. King Henry was a kind of playboy kind of person. He was always the center of attraction. In the beginning itself, I told you, Henry was the second son, so it was always Arthur. He knew that he would not become the king, and it was Arthur who was trained to be the king of England. But no one predicted, or no one knew that such a fate awaited him, and therefore Henry grew up from his childhood. He was a very handsome boy. Henry VIII, he was a very handsome boy, and he was a kind of playboy kind of a person, and he was interested in pleasing everybody. He was a center of attraction. He loved that attention as well, and after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and after many years, again this nature became there is always a basic character in everyone, right? That basic trait does not change even if you grow up. So this basic character of this playboy kind of a feel, it was there with Henry all the time. So he was always attracted to many women. And even when he was married to Catherine of Aragon, he still continued to have many mistresses and many love affairs as well, without actually disrupting his marriage, because to him, his queen was important, Catherine was important, but when she failed to produce an heir to the throne, that was when problem started. Not just there is another reason also why he wanted to send Catherine of Aragon back to Spain. That means there was a reason as to why he wanted to have a divorce, and that was because Henry was infatuated with Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to marry her at any cost. And this incident led to a chain of events that led to the England's revolt, or England setting itself free from the Catholic Church. The Pope during Henry's time was Pope Clement VII, and he refused to annul the marriage. Divorce in those days was nothing like you have now. Marriage was considered for a lifetime, and the only reason for a divorce was if the Pope himself allowed you to have one. So 2 reasons led Henry to seek divorce by hook or crook. One, Catherine was not producing an heir to the throne. Another was that he was infatuated by Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had initially refused to be his mistress. This attracted him even more. She was bold to tell him a firm no. And that is basically because Anne knew how Henry treated his other mistresses. He fiddles with them for some time and then gets them married off to some nobles or somebody else. So she said she doesn't want any of those things. She doesn't want to continue that legacy. Her older sister herself had been a mistress to Henry the Eighth. So she had seen what had happened in Henry's court and what all things happened to these women who became his mistress. So she said, I'm not going to sleep with you unless and until we are married. So that sudden it was like a sudden blow to a man who's so powerful, a woman who and barely from any aristocracy comes there and he woos her and she suddenly says no outrightly, and that was like an attack, and he therefore fell immensely in love with her. He wanted to marry her by hook or crook. So Henry is known for being a spoiled player and always getting what he wanted. So this passion for Anne Boleyn led him to divorce Catherine and marry this bold, beautiful woman, Anne Boleyn. Now, but the Pope refused several times. I did tell you of what Renaissance is and its effect, and how one impact of the Renaissance was the Reformation of the Church. And so Henry said, with all this Reformation going on in England and in Europe, he decides to tell the Church, or he decides to take complete control over England, and he wants the Pope to stay out of the civics, or stay out of politics and the government affairs. Church is only meant for spiritual affairs and nothing more than that. And besides, an individual has the right to do what he pleases. He alone is in control over his destiny. It is not the church that is in control over him. It is he who is in control over his destiny. So whatever he chooses right. It's not the church that would tell him how to live. The individual has the right to live as he pleases. Issues the Act of Supremacy in 1534, where the entire country, England, broke away from the Catholic Church. They formed the new church called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, with the king as the head of the church. But you must note that there was not much difference in the way they, or in their beliefs. They were mostly Catholic only. The only difference was in who was the head of the church. In the Catholic Church, it was the Pope, and in the Anglican Church, it was the king who was in charge, or who was the head of the church. Now, thus, by becoming the head of the church, Henry granted his own divorce, shipped Catherine off to Spain, and married Anne Boleyn. Now, this was a very it's not a diplomatic move. It was indeed a very powerful move. Sorry, not a diplomatic move, not at all a diplomatic move, because that we will see later on that it was in fact a very stupid move from Henry's part in marrying Anne Boleyn. But if you are to look at it in this way, that is, becoming the head of the Anglican Church was in fact a very good move from Henry's side, because Henry became the richest. One thing, he got what he wanted. He got a divorce from his first wife, and he also got the woman he wanted. The second thing was that he became the richest man in the entire Europe, because now with the Catholic Church gone, all the properties, the wealth, the material prospects of the Catholic Church, or the material wealth of the Catholic Church, were now the part and parcel of England, and it was under the control of the king. And therefore the king used it for his personal use and also for governing the state. Unfortunately, the marriage with Anne Boleyn was also not a happy one. It ended too soon, and it did not end well at all. Henry is well known for his wives. He had 6 wives, and only 2 daughters and 1 son survived in all these marriages. And his son dies at a very early age. So the first wife, that is the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, she has been divorced by Henry. She's been she's been packed off to Spain. He has himself granted his own divorce by being the head of the Catholic Church, and 1 daughter survives in their marriage, and that is Mary, who later will become Queen Mary. Now the next wife, that is Anne Boleyn, she was not liked by English people. Anyway, Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry. Henry felt that now he has everything he would have. He has he would have the best years of his life. Anne was young, she was beautiful, but there was one problem. People hated Anne Boleyn. Well, only Henry loved her. The public loved Catherine. Since Henry was now being powerful and is the head of the church, people could accept only a royal princess or a royal blood as their queen. Anne Boleyn was known as a witch. She was called Nan Boleyn, and people said that she bewitched the king. When they went out together in the countrysides, people used to boo at Anne Boleyn, and Henry's advisors also didn't like her. Almost everybody hated her. Remember again Henry's upbringing. He always liked to be the center of attraction. He wanted everybody to love him, and when things turned out, or when things really went bad with Anne Boleyn and people started hating him too, he started to see her in a different light. She did give birth to another child, and things would have been well and beautiful with her had she been able to give birth to a baby boy. Things would have been better. Maybe Henry would have accepted her. However, fate did not, or luck did not favor her, and she gave birth to her child in the 5th month, giving birth to a stillborn child, that is. And thus, with this happening, things turned very bad for her. Anne was devastated and lost all her hopes. Henry took this as an extreme side from God, and he felt that it was, he thought that it was like it was God who was punishing him for what he has done to Catherine. He felt guilty of whatever he has done, and he felt that he shouldn't have acted, or he should never have married Anne Boleyn. Anne also had several enemies at the court at this time, and they trumped up a bunch of charges against her and claimed that she had been unfaithful to Henry. That means she had been into various adulterous affairs, but that was not the truth. It was a made up or cooked up stories by her enemies. enemies or by the enemies at the court, and thus Henry sends her to, or gets her tried. See, during that time, if the queen is unfaithful, that is considered a treason, and she was tried, and she was imprisoned in the Tower of London and later executed. That was it for just 3 years of a little over 3 years. So she also was known, or she became known as Anne of 1,000 Days, because she was queen just for 1,000 days, meaning hardly a little over 3 years perhaps. And her daughter was Elizabeth, and whom you would later see as the most powerful queen that England ever had, the Virgin Queen, that is Queen Elizabeth, the first daughter born to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Now, Henry, what did he do? He wanted to justify his reasons for having Anne killed or executed, and thus he declared that Elizabeth was an illegitimate child, and that was the reason why Henry executed Anne Boleyn. But that was not true. Elizabeth was very much like her father. You could say the carbon copy of Henry VIII. She was beautiful, just like, or she was good looking, just like Henry VIII. She had his red hair, his looks, and she was intelligent, extremely intelligent and clever, just like Henry VIII. Now, next wife of Henry, we shall be going to Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth a little later, because that marks the beginning. Queen Elizabeth marks the beginning of the Elizabethan age. But before that, you have to understand some more of the wives of King Henry VIII. Next wife of King Henry was Jane Seymour, and again, she was a mistress. She was quite sweet, and she was also very soft-spoken. Henry loved her and married her. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and Henry was happy. But here also, luck does not favor Henry. She dies of fever soon after giving birth to her to his son. So Henry has a daughter by Catherine called Mary, another daughter, a second daughter by Anne Boleyn, and a son, Edward, by Jane Seymour. Now, after all these marriages, he now wanted a political marriage. That's the irony, okay? You really ought to hear this story. Now, this political marriage, he was tired of all the love and romances, and therefore he wanted to keep his neighbors, he wanted to maintain a friendly relation with his neighbors, and he wanted to make himself politically strong. So he decides to go in for a marriage with Anne of Cleves, a Germanic princess. Now, the marriage is very strange because Henry does not get to see Anne of Cleves. Not Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves. Okay, a Germanic princess. Now, Anne of Cleves, they do not meet. Neither does Henry nor does Anne of Cleves meet. And they meet only after their wedding. And the wedding itself was like the ministers and advisors alone. They were the ones who brought this about. They felt that this is a great opportunity for the country to be financially and politically secure. So Henry never gets to meet Anne, and they do something called married by proxy. Now, what is this marriage by proxy? The bride and the bridegroom, they don't get to see each other. They instead, you have a minister, or they would have a representative from both the sides, a representative from the bride's side and a representative from the bridegroom side, and then they would stand in a wedding ceremony and do their parts. Like, they would get married. They would, they are the ones who are signing the deal. Okay, that's marriage by proxy. And it's an official marriage without the bride or the bridegroom. Now, Henry meets Anne of Cleves only when they got together after their marriage. Anne was not at all good looking. In fact, she was hideous. She had a lot of marks on her skin, maybe from chicken pox or scars. It seems that Henry took only one look at her, and that was it. He could not withstand, or he couldn't stand this woman at all, because right from Catherine of Aragon to Jane Seymour, all were extremely beautiful women that he had as wives. And now comes another, this lady, Anne of Cleves, who looks hideous, and he cannot stand it, and therefore he sends her back. So you have how many wives now? Catherine, you have Anne Boleyn, you have Jane, and now you have Anne of Cleves. Again, this marriage is also separated, or it's annulled or divorced. Now, next, he goes for another marriage, and he gets married to Catherine Howard. Here Henry has become old. He's started to look older. And Catherine Howard, another big mistake that Henry did, because she was only 16 and 17. She was like a dumb blonde who was beautiful but giggly and, very flirtish kind of a nature, because that was her age, 16 or 17. She was hardly 16 or 17, and Henry was almost in her 40s, or in his 40s or 30s. So he was looking older, and he was very stout. So this was another mistake that Henry did. Henry gets married, and Henry's full of love for her, but Catherine, she has an affair. Now this time, this affair is really adulterous. She has an adulterous affair with right under Henry's nose, and he catches both of them in bed together, and that's the end of Catherine. Henry executes her for high treason. She's sent to the Tower, and she is executed. So that is the final end of Catherine Howard. And then now Henry is really, really old, and he's sick, and he's suffering from gout. Gout is a kind of illness where you get affected, your joints are all affected, they become inflamed, and he also suffered from respiratory problems, respiratory illness, and he therefore finds another wife, and again of the same name, Catherine, but this time it's not Catherine Howard, it's Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr, who is a little older, a widow herself, and she's well placed She has always been in Henry's court and knows Henry's children, and she basically becomes his nurse. So thus you have all the 6 wives of Henry VIII. We start with Catherine, divorced. Then comes Anne Boleyn, beheaded. Then comes Jane Seymour, dies. Then you have Anne of Cleves, divorced. Then we have Catherine Howard, beheaded. Last, you have Catherine Parr, survives. So it's like this. It's very funny and very ironical as well. If you look at it, you have divorced, beheaded, dies. Divorce, beheaded, survives. The 6 wives. If you look at 6 wives of Henry VIII, you have them in this, in this manner, in this chain. Divorced, beheaded, dies. Divorced, beheaded, survives. Okay, so that's it with Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Now, in the next class, we shall move on to his children, who survives, or who comes to the power, who rules England after Henry's death. But that in the next class. So thank you, and stay home, stay safe, happy learning.